Whispers of History.
The Civil War had carved Missouri into a land of shadows. By 1864, the rolling hills and river valleys were soaked not only with blood spilled in battle, but with the dread of lawlessness that crept into every town and homestead. The state was torn between loyalty to the Union and sympathy for the Confederacy, its borders a breeding ground for guerrillas, deserters, and men who no longer belonged to either side. And among them, whispered about in the fearful tones of campfire tales, were the outlaws who would soon be remembered for a crime so grotesque that even hardened soldiers recoiled when they heard it. These were not the polished gunfighters of dime novels, or the gallant bandits who robbed trains under a banner of false chivalry. They were something else. Drifters without allegiance, predators who wore the tatters of soldiers' coats and carried knives streaked with rust. They prowled the countryside where war had already broken trust and stripped away the thin veneer of civilization. What they wanted was not just gold or horses or whiskey. What they took went far beyond the ordinary brutality of bushwhackers. They took flesh. Imagine a farmhouse along a dirt road, its windows shuttered, smoke rising thin from a dying chimney fire. Inside, a family whispers in fear, knowing that men like these could appear at any moment. Farmers left their fields untended, not because of marching armies, but because of rumors, stories of travelers who never reached their destinations, of bones found stripped clean near the edges of the forest, of strangers who shared meals by firelight and left their hosts' cabins in silence before dawn, leaving only a dark stain on the floor. For those who lived through it, the fear was almost unspeakable. War itself was horror enough, but this was something ancient, something primal. To think of men not just killing for survival or in battle, but consuming their victims, turning neighbors and travelers into meat, was a violation so profound it echoed like blasphemy. It was as though the thin line that held back barbarism had been snapped clean, leaving only the gnawing hunger of beasts who still wore human faces. And in 1864, Missouri, with towns emptied, soldiers scattered, and the rule of law little more than a rumor, it was exactly the kind of place where such horrors could flourish unseen. Who were these men? How could human beings, already brutalized by war, descend into something even darker? Did desperation and starvation drive them? Or was there something deeper? Something in their minds, something in their very souls, that made them capable of tearing the flesh of another human being from bone? The story of the outlaws who ate their victims is one that has long lived in the shadows of Missouri's history. Part folklore, part grim documentation from scattered records and frightened testimonies, it is a tale that both repels and fascinates. It forces us to ask, what happens when civilization collapses, when hunger and cruelty meet on the frontier of a fractured nation? In this hour, we will step into that twilight world, not as participants, but as investigators of the past. We will listen to the whispers of survivors, the chilling reports carried in old newspapers, and the half-erased stories that families never dared tell in daylight. This is not the story of famous outlaws whose names became legends. This is the story of men whose names were often erased, whose memory was left to rot like the victims they left behind. It is about what humans are capable of when the boundaries of morality disintegrate under the weight of violence and need. So sit with me as we travel back to a Missouri at war with itself, where lawless bands roamed unchecked, and where in the shadows of the Ozark woods and river valleys, horror wore the face of men who called themselves outlaws. They were not merely killers. They crossed a line that humanity is not meant to cross. And once you hear their story, you may find yourself wondering, not only about the past, but about the fragility of the rules we live by today. Because if men in Missouri could once do this, what is it that truly separates us from them? To understand the outlaws who horrified Missouri in 1864, we first need to step into the world in which they lived. This was not a stable society with reliable laws, well-fed families, and clear lines of justice. This was Missouri, a border state caught in the merciless grip of the American Civil War. It was neither fully Union nor fully Confederate. Instead, it became a fractured landscape where loyalty was constantly shifting, where neighbors could become enemies overnight, and where the thin fabric of daily life was torn apart by hunger, suspicion, and fear. The mid-19th century was already a difficult time in rural America. Missouri's economy was largely agricultural, with farmers growing corn, wheat, and tobacco, while others raised cattle or hogs. These were people who lived close to the land, often in small log cabins surrounded by untamed forest. Roads were rough and travel was slow. A journey of a few miles might take hours, and isolated families often went weeks without seeing anyone beyond their nearest neighbors. In peaceful times, this isolation fostered resilience and independence. But in times of war, it meant vulnerability. By 1861, when the Civil War erupted, Missouri became a contested ground. Both the Union and the Confederacy claimed it. Guerrilla fighters, known locally as bushwhackers, roamed the countryside, raiding farms, burning barns, and killing suspected enemies. Many young men joined irregular bands that fought under no official flag, men who answered to local leaders rather than military officers. These fighters lived off the land, taking what they needed by force, leaving devastation in their wake. It was a climate that blurred the line between soldier and outlaw, between war and murder. The violence was not confined to soldiers alone. Entire families were uprooted. Women and children were forced to abandon their homes when armies swept through. Fields lay untended, harvests spoiled, and hunger spread like a shadow across the state. People who once relied on trade in nearby towns now found markets shuttered and roads too dangerous to travel. Even livestock became a target. Wandering bands stole pigs, cattle, and horses, stripping farms of their livelihood in a single night. In this chaos, traditional authority dissolved. Sheriffs and constables were powerless against armed raiders. Courts stopped functioning in many counties. The newspaper presses, when they continued to operate at all, carried stories of atrocities that seemed unbelievable, yet were happening almost daily. One week, reports of Union militia burning a Confederate sympathizer's farm. The next, tales of guerrillas ambushing Union soldiers, leaving bodies mutilated. The war had turned Missouri into a land where cruelty was not the exception, but the rule, and into this environment came hunger. The war disrupted trade and farming so severely that in many areas, food simply ran out. Families relied on foraging, hunting, or whatever they could preserve. Salt, a vital tool for curing meat, became scarce and expensive. Coffee, sugar, and flour vanished from shelves. People boiled roots into thin soups and ground acorns to make flour substitutes. Hunger gnawed at the bellies of not only soldiers but civilians. And hunger, more than anything else, has the power to strip away human restraint. Culturally, Missouri in the 1860s was a divided society. German immigrants settled in some areas, staunchly pro-Union and determined to resist Confederate influence. Meanwhile, older Anglo-American settlers often leaned toward the South, bound by heritage and a dependence on slavery. These divisions created deep mistrust. A German farmer might eye his neighbor with suspicion, wondering if his allegiance to the Confederacy would bring bushwhackers to his door. A Southern sympathizer, in turn, might fear that Union militias would burn his home in retaliation. In such an atmosphere, betrayal felt inevitable, and paranoia became a constant companion. Religion offered little comfort. Missouri was filled with Protestant churches, Methodist, Baptist, Lutheran, but even congregations split along political lines. Preachers thundered about God's judgment on the nation, some declaring that the war was punishment for slavery, others insisting it was divine retribution for abandoning tradition. In every sermon, the message was the same. Suffering was to be expected, and the end of days might be near. For desperate people living in isolation, the sense that civilization itself was collapsing only deepened the despair. It was in this world of fractured loyalties, empty stomachs, and fading moral codes that the darkest acts could take root. Imagine a man, once a farmer, whose fields are burned and whose family starves. He joins a band of raiders not out of loyalty to a cause, but to survive. At first, they steal corn and hogs. Then, when even livestock grows scarce, they take from travelers. Then, one night, in the flicker of firelight, a line is crossed. Hunger, rage, and opportunity converge, and what was once unthinkable becomes possible. The cultural memory of cannibalism is one of humanity's deepest taboos. Across societies, to consume another human being has always been marked as an act of ultimate violation, reserved for tales of monsters, not men. Yet history shows that in times of famine and war, even this taboo can be broken. Missouri in 1864 was a place where hunger had hollowed out souls, and where law no longer held power. The conditions were set for atrocity. This is the Missouri in which the story of the outlaws who ate their victims unfolded. It was not just about individuals driven by cruelty. It was about a society that had collapsed into chaos, where survival often came at the expense of morality, and where men became wolves in a land already haunted by death. And as we trace their actions, we must remember, they did not appear in a vacuum. They were the offspring of war, famine, and a culture already drowning in violence. The year was 1864, and Missouri was a place soaked in violence. Along the back roads, where oak trees arched over muddy paths and broken wagons lay abandoned, stories began to circulate about a small band of men who did not merely rob their victims. They erased them. At first, these tales seemed like another set of wartime exaggerations, the kind neighbors whispered around fireplaces when the night grew too still. But as bodies were found, or rather parts of bodies, the truth emerged in fragments more horrifying than rumor. It began with a peddler, a man who wandered from homestead to homestead with his cart of trinkets, tools, and needles, selling what little he could to keep families afloat in the middle of the war. He was last seen on the road between Lexington and Warrensburg, his cart rattling under the weight of goods. A week later, his mule was found wandering loose, its harness cut, the cart overturned in the brush. The man himself had vanished. A search party scoured the area but found only scraps of clothing, torn and stained dark. The whispers grew louder. He had fallen victim to bushwhackers. Yet those who stumbled upon a burned-out campfire nearby swore they saw bones blackened in the ashes, bones too large to belong to any hog. Not long after, a family of settlers traveling westward disappeared without trace. Their wagon was found near the banks of the Missouri River, wheels sunk deep in the mud as though abandoned in haste. The oxen were gone, either stolen or driven off, but more chilling was the discovery inside the wagon: a blood-stained mattress and a scattering of small shoes. Witnesses described the eerie silence of the scene, as if the family had simply been lifted out of existence. But weeks later, hunters found remains in a hollowed gully nearby, gnawed and broken, as though animals had feasted there. Yet the marks on the bones told another story. They were clean, deliberate cuts, made by steel, not claws. The most infamous incident came when a group of Union soldiers, traveling off duty, vanished after leaving camp to visit a nearby tavern. When they failed to return, their comrades began searching the woods. What they uncovered sickened even men hardened by war. Buried shallow beneath leaves and soil were the remains of the soldiers, stripped of valuables, but more grotesquely, stripped of flesh in places. Limbs were missing entirely. The campfire near the burial site reeked of burnt meat, a stench that clung to the clothes of the men who discovered it. Soldiers who had seen death on battlefields swore they had never witnessed something so vile, so animal. Panic began to spread through the countryside. Families barred their doors, refusing to travel except in groups. Ministers preached of sin and warned their congregations that the devil himself was walking in Missouri. Some whispered that these crimes were not the work of men at all, but of spirits, or demons drawn to the blood-soaked land of war. Yet those who lived closer to the woods insisted they had seen a band of men moving through the night, ragged and wild-eyed, armed not only with rifles but with axes and knives, their clothes stained and their faces hollow with hunger. Among locals, these men were soon given a name: the Devourers. Survivors of attacks spoke of being ambushed on quiet roads, pulled from their wagons by hands that seemed more beast than human. One woman who escaped by throwing herself into the river claimed she heard laughter behind her, laughter that followed her even as she swam for her life. Her husband was never found. Days later, scraps of his clothing were discovered hanging from branches, and hunters swore they found bones cracked open for the marrow. The horror escalated with each telling. Farmers reported finding pits in the woods filled with half-burned remains. Travelers vanished on routes once considered safe. Even children walking to school were warned never to go alone, for fear that the Devourers would take them. Rumors claimed the outlaws had begun to use decoys, setting up false campfires to lure travelers in. When victims approached, thinking they had found fellow wanderers, they were met instead with knives flashing in the dark. The brutality was not only physical but psychological. Survivors described how the men seemed to revel in terror, sometimes letting a victim run before hunting them down again, as if the fear itself fed them. One farmer who managed to escape recounted how they had bound him and forced him to watch as they butchered another captive, slicing flesh with the same efficiency as a butcher dressing hogs. The farmer fled when the men grew careless, too busy feasting to notice him slip away into the brush. His testimony, written later in a local paper, was dismissed by some as delirium. But the details, descriptions of knives, the manner of cutting, the smell of roasting meat, were too precise to be imagination. Each incident left the countryside more shaken, but also more determined to stop them. Pauses were formed and militias scoured the backwoods. Yet the band was clever. They moved often, never staying in one camp for long, blending into the chaos of the war. In some places, they passed as simple deserters or ragged Confederate bushwhackers. In others, they posed as starving refugees. It was only when blood was spilled and Bones discovered that their true identity became clear. What made their crime stand out was not merely the killing. Missouri had already grown numb to murder, but what followed. To consume another human was to cross a line so deep it shook the very core of the community. The whispers of cannibalism struck at primal fears, spreading dread far beyond the actual incidents. Mothers pulled their children closer at night. Men carried rifles even when plowing fields. And ministers, their voices trembling, warned that Missouri's sins had summoned monsters in human skin. By the end of 1864, their legend had eclipsed fact. Some claimed there were only 3 men in the band, others swore there were 10 or more. Some said they were Union deserters, others believed they were Confederate raiders gone rogue. A few whispered that they had once been ordinary farmers, driven mad by hunger when crops failed. But in every version of the story, the same chilling detail remained. Their victims were not just robbed or killed, they were eaten. The news of the devourers spread not like ordinary rumor, but like wildfire carried on the wind. In small towns and farmsteads across Missouri, people repeated the stories in hushed voices, lowering their tone as though the very air might carry their words back to the outlaws. It was one thing to speak of raiders, of guerrilla bands who burned barns or stole livestock, but it was another to speak of men who feasted on flesh. Even in a land made numb by war, this detail was too grotesque, too unnatural. For many, the first reaction was denial. Families told themselves these were only war tales, the kind meant to frighten children into staying close to home. But when wagons failed to arrive, when neighbors disappeared, when bones were uncovered with marks no animal could leave, denial gave way to dread. Churches filled with fearful congregants, ministers pounding their pulpits with fire in their eyes, declaring that Missouri had become a modern Gomorrah. They warned their flocks that the devourers were not merely criminals but emissaries of Satan, roaming the countryside as punishment for the sins of a divided land. Doctors, though fewer in number in those troubled years, were called to examine the remains that were found. Their observations were clinical yet chilling. One physician from Lexington noted that bones carried precise incisions, the kind made with sharp steel rather than by accident or scavenger animals. Another, writing in his journal, confessed that he had treated wounds on a man who survived an attack. The cuts were deliberate, meant not only to harm but to harvest. These reports, once whispered through medical circles, lent weight to the rumors. If even the men of science hinted that cannibalism had taken place, what room was left for doubt? Local newspapers became both amplifiers of the terror and reluctant record-keepers of the crimes. In Jefferson City, the Missouri Statesman published a brief column about the wild men of the woods, suggesting that war had driven some deserters into savagery. The editor chose his words carefully, yet between the lines the implication was clear. The stories of flesh-eating were not entirely baseless. Other papers, less cautious, indulged in sensationalism, printing lurid accounts of travelers roasted and consumed by firelight. While these stories drew readers, they also deepened the sense of unease, leaving Missourians to wonder if such horrors lurked just beyond their doorsteps. Neighbors turned suspicious of one another. A ragged man asking for bread at a farmhouse door might once have been given a crust or a warm meal, but now he was met with rifles aimed across thresholds. Strangers were no longer pitied but feared. Families that had once relied on hospitality to survive the uncertainties of the frontier began to live behind locked shutters and bolted doors. Travelers were eyed warily at taverns, their mannerisms studied for signs of deceit. Suspicion turned the land into a cold and watchful place, where kindness was smothered by fear. Pastors sought to provide not only guidance but also explanations. Some framed the devourers as a manifestation of divine wrath, arguing that God had allowed them to rise as a test of faith. Others pointed to the violence of the war itself, suggesting that men who had seen too much blood were driven into madness and sin. A few invoked biblical stories of famine, saying hunger had always been the companion of war, and that desperation had stripped these men of their humanity. Whatever the explanation, the sermons left congregants uneasy, as though nothing in Scripture could fully account for the horror they faced. Psychological interpretations were harder to come by in 1864, but in hindsight, historians and scholars have offered perspectives that would have been unthinkable at the time. War had already fractured minds, leaving thousands traumatized, though the word did not yet exist in their vocabulary. In such chaos, groups of desperate men might have turned to cannibalism not only out of hunger, but also as a form of domination, a way to terrify their victims and control the land through fear. To a community unfamiliar with the language of psychology, these explanations would have sounded like excuses, but to modern eyes, they offer a glimpse into how violence can evolve into atrocity. The militia and local posses responded with both fury and caution. Armed patrols scoured the woods, following rumors of campfires or abandoned sites. Yet each time they believed they had cornered the devourers, the men vanished into the wilderness, leaving behind nothing but ashes and bones. Their ability to disappear fed the belief that they were more than human, creatures of darkness who could not be caught by ordinary means. Farmers whispered of charms and rituals to ward them off, carrying talismans made of iron or inscribed prayers sewn into clothing. Fear seeped into daily routines, altering the rhythms of life. What disturbed people most was not just the savagery of the acts, but the thought that these men had once been ordinary. Neighbors speculated endlessly. Were they failed farmers, unable to feed their families? Were they deserters, broken by the endless war? Or had they always been inclined to cruelty, simply waiting for the chaos of war to unmask them? The inability to know their origins made the threat all the more terrifying, because it suggested that under the strain of hunger and violence, anyone might become like them. In time, the devourers became less a specific band of men and more a figure of folklore. Parents warned their children, "Do not wander into the woods, or the flesh-eaters will find you." Songs were whispered, grim ballads sung around hearths that described shadowy figures with blood on their hands and fire in their eyes. The legend transcended the reality, but the fear remained rooted in the very real discovery of mutilated remains, the stench of campfires where meat had burned, the silence of missing travelers never found again. Communities sought solace in prayer, in vigilance, and in the belief that justice would come. But the memory of those years lingered, even after the war ended. It lingered in the way doors were locked earlier, in the suspicious glances cast at strangers, and in the sermons that reminded listeners that civilization was but a thin veil, easily torn away. The devourers had not only killed their victims, they had killed the fragile sense of safety that bound Missouri's communities together. The winter of 1864 closed in, and Missouri lay under a pall of fear. Snow blanketed the woods, muting the sound of hoofbeats and muffling cries that might otherwise have carried through the night. Yet in the silence, the devourers did not sleep. Their raids grew bolder, their cruelty sharper. Farmers spoke of seeing smoke rising from the trees at night, too faint to be ordinary campfires, and they whispered that every glow was a signal of another feast. The countryside, already bruised by war, reached a breaking point. It was in late December, near a remote stretch of land outside Warrensburg, that the final confrontation took shape. A wagon train of settlers, determined to push west despite the dangers, fell into the devourers' trap. The settlers had paused at a clearing, their oxen weary and their fires low, when shadows emerged from the tree line. The first cries were muffled by the snow, but the horror was swift and overwhelming. Knives and axes flashed in the dark, the outlaws cutting through the camp with a ferocity that echoed the battlefields. Families scattered into the woods, but few made it far. Some were dragged down, their screams cut short. Others fell where they stood. The snow, white and untouched, was stained crimson in moments. One young boy, hidden beneath an overturned wagon, later told of what he saw through the gaps in the wood. He claimed the outlaws did not merely kill, but lingered, circling their victims like hunters savoring the chase. He saw them crouch beside the fallen, their faces hollow, their movements methodical. He said they took not gold nor valuables, but flesh, cutting with precision, feeding even as the fires hissed and the survivors fled into the frozen dark. His words, when repeated to a local pastor, left the man trembling, unable to finish his sermon the following Sunday. Word of the slaughter reached a nearby Union encampment within days. Soldiers weary from battles yet driven by outrage formed a posse with local farmers. They tracked the devourers through the snow, following prints and scraps left in their wake. Along the path, they found remnants that chilled them more than any corpse. Half-eaten remains, scattered bones, and a fire still smoldering, its ash heavy with the smell of burned meat. Hardened men retched in the snow, yet they pressed on, fury tightening their ranks. The confrontation came at dawn. The posse found the outlaws in a clearing, huddled around another fire. At first they looked like starving animals, gaunt and ragged, their clothes torn and their eyes sunken. But as the men approached, the outlaws rose with sudden energy, brandishing knives and axes, shrieking like creatures cornered. What followed was not a battle of soldiers against men, but something closer to an exorcism. Shots rang out, echoing through the trees, mingled with screams both human and inhuman. Steel clashed, and blood splattered onto the snow until red and white blurred together. One outlaw, larger than the rest, fought with terrifying strength, cutting down two men before he was felled by a rifle shot to the chest. Another, cornered against a tree, refused to surrender, slashing wildly until he was struck down. Yet even as they fell, the devourers did not beg, nor cry for mercy. Witnesses swore they laughed, a hideous guttural laughter that chilled the blood, until the last breath left their lungs. When the guns finally fell silent, the clearing lay littered with bodies. The posse had killed them all, or so they believed. But what they found when they searched the camp shook them even more deeply than the fight itself. Bundles of human remains lay stacked like butcher's cuts, wrapped in cloth and tied with twine. Some were hung from trees as though drying in the cold air. The fire pit was filled with bones blackened by flame, and scattered nearby were utensils, forks, knives, plates, set out as if in preparation for a meal. This was not desperation. This was ritual. The men stood in stunned silence, the smoke curling upward as though carrying the souls of the dead. Some crossed themselves, others prayed aloud. One soldier dropped to his knees and wept, saying he had faced the horrors of Shiloh and Vicksburg, but nothing had ever scarred him like this. Another muttered that these men were not human at all, but beasts wearing the skin of men. The bodies of the devourers were buried in unmarked graves, covered quickly with frozen earth. No prayers were spoken. The survivors of the posse agreed to speak little of what they had seen, fearing that the tale was too terrible, too unholy to repeat. Yet fragments leaked into the newspapers, distorted by time and retelling, until the devourers became less men and more myth. Still, those who were there, those who saw the fire, the flesh, the laughter, carried the memory with them, a wound no healing could erase. Missouri's war had given birth to many monsters, but none so unforgettable as the outlaws who ate their victims. In the months that followed, Missouri tried to bury the memory as it had buried the bodies. The newspapers printed vague accounts of bandits destroyed in the woods, leaving out the darker details. No mention of the flesh found, no word of the grotesque feasts. It was safer, perhaps, to let the story dissolve into the haze of wartime rumor. Yet the survivors could not forget. Their silence was not denial, it was fear. Families who had lost loved ones to the devourers whispered prayers at night, not for the souls of the murdered, but for the uneasy spirits of the killers themselves. Children were warned never to wander into the forests after dark. Hunters swore they saw strange shadows near the abandoned campsites, flickering figures that vanished when approached. One farmer claimed that when he lit his lantern near a certain grove, the smoke smelled of burning meat, though no fire had touched the ground in years. Some spoke of curses. Others turned to science, arguing that starvation during wartime could drive men into madness, into cannibalism, stripping away every layer of civilization. Doctors tried to explain it as war neurosis or hunger psychosis, a sickness that turned the mind against itself. But even these rational words failed to soothe the deeper unease. It was not just hunger that haunted those men. There had been choice in their violence, ritual in their cruelty, intention in their hunger. By the late 19th century, the story of the Missouri devourers had shifted into folklore. Campfire tales told of men with hollow eyes who stalked travelers, waiting for the weak to fall behind. Folklorists collected accounts from old farmers who swore their fathers had seen the eaters lurking by riversides. Some versions softened the horror, claiming the outlaws had been wolves in disguise, shapeshifters cursed to walk as men. Others leaned into the terror, describing them as soldiers so corrupted by war that they rose again at night, bound forever to their hunger. And still, the forests kept their silence. Bones occasionally surfaced during logging or plowing, scattered and half-buried in the soil. Most were dismissed as victims of the war. But every so often, the arrangement of cuts on the bones suggested otherwise. Marks too deliberate, too precise, as if made not by accident, but by design. The questions hung heavy in the air. How many victims were there truly? And were all of the devourers killed that frozen morning? Or had some escaped into the wilderness, their hunger unsatisfied? By the turn of the century, travelers along the old wagon trails spoke of hearing laughter carried on the wind. Others described stumbling upon strange makeshift shrines deep in the woods. Stones stacked with bones, twine tied around tree branches, animal skulls arranged in patterns. The resemblance to the outlaw camps of 1864 was too striking to ignore. Locals avoided these places, marking them as cursed ground, the last traces of men who had lost all claim to humanity. Even now, the memory clings to Missouri's soil like a shadow. History books glance past it, but the land does not forget. Some say that if you walk the old trails at dusk, you can hear footsteps behind you, soft at first, then closer, until you turn and find nothing but emptiness. Others claim that on bitterly cold nights, when the wind sweeps low across the fields, you can smell smoke, faint and acrid, as if from a fire that has long since burned out. Was it madness, born from hunger and war? Was it ritual, a cult of appetite that found its home in chaos? Or was it something older still, something that wears human skin when famine comes, feeding on both flesh and fear? The truth lies buried but not forgotten. The graves are unmarked, yet the memory walks. And so the tale of the devourers lingers, like a wound that will not heal. A reminder that beneath the surface of history's wars and heroes lies another story, one of darkness, of men who crossed a threshold no one should ever cross. Missouri's soil remembers, and if the stories are true, the woods still whisper their names.